This Sunday is Pentecost Sunday. Many churches in the United States are trying to open up and allow at least some of its church members back to the church building to worship. The lockdown are still in effect all over the country. What has lockdown to do with Pentecost? Let's take a look. Lockdown, then Pentecost. Chapter 1 of the book of Acts. After Jesus ascended into heaven. Verse 12. The Mount of Olives was about half a mile from Jerusalem. The apostles who have gone there were Peter, John, James, Andrew, Philip, Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon, known as the Eager One, and Judas the son of James. After the apostles returned to the city, they went upstairs to the room where they had been staying. The apostles often met together and prayed with a single purpose in mind. The women and Mary the mother of Jesus would meet with them, and so would his brothers. So from the Mount of Olives, where Jesus ascended into heaven, they went back to Jerusalem and stayed in the upper room where they were. And these were some of the people. What were the disciples doing in the upper room? Acts 1:14, it says, the apostles often met there and prayed with a single purpose of mind, or in one accord. That's the place they are used to gather and pray. And then also, going down to verse 26, they drew names, and Matthias was chosen to join the group of the 11 apostles. Peter told the other disciples that they need to find someone to replace Judas, who sold Jesus and has hanged himself. And Matthias was chosen. They stayed in the upper room off and on for 7 days. So yes, in a way, it was a lockdown, but it was voluntary. Earlier, after Jesus was crucified, they stayed in the upper room, have the doors and windows shut and locked for fear of the government. Were they still in fear of the government? Probably. So they stayed there voluntarily. And also, they stayed there because before Jesus ascended into heaven, verse 4, Jesus said, don't leave Jerusalem yet. Wait here for the Father to give you the Holy Spirit, just as I told you he has promised to do. So in obedience to what Jesus told them, they stay in the upper room waiting. So those were the activities described in the Bible of what the disciples were doing. There were about 120 of them praying, talking, and selected Matthias and waiting. Now it's God's turn to show his timing. Going into chapter 2. On the day of Pentecost, there's 1 week after the ascension. It's also on the Lord's Day, or the first day of the week. all the Lord's followers were gathered in one place. We talked about that already. Suddenly, there was a noise from heaven. The Holy Spirit took control of everyone, and they began speaking whatever languages the Spirit led them to speak. All right, so think about it. These disciples were gathered in the upper room again, praying, waiting to see what is going to happen. They did not plan for anything. They're just quietly waiting and praying without making any fuss, especially outside of the upper room. But all of a sudden, something happened. Now you know the rest of the story. The Holy Spirit came, landed on each one of them, and they began to speak in tongues. They're no longer locked up in the upper room. Did they open the doors and the windows and start going out into the marketplace? Evidently, because many people heard their sermons in their own language. Christianity and the church as we know it began on that Pentecost Sunday, and it lasted until now and expanded to every continent. Yes, you and I are being locked down, like it or not, as individuals or as a family. For me, it's just me and my wife. Many businesses and even the church physically are locked down, not just in the United States, but practically in many, many countries in the world. We are waiting for what we don't really know, unknown. We're waiting for the government to say, now you can go out, you can go to the beach or whatever. But we have been waiting. During this time, we are puzzled, depressed, anxious, bored, tired, upset, just to name a few. Life is not normal. Why? We can't wait to get out. And sometimes at whatever cost. Look at the beaches in California where I live. Look at other places when people are sort of allowed to go out again, seem to be free and careless. Well, the question is, what is God doing during all this time? What has God been doing in the last 10 weeks or so? The disciples were 7 days. But for us, seemingly God is not doing anything. There's no cure. There's no vaccine, even though the death rate has dropped. But people are still scared. The unknown for the future. Well, what would happen to the church, to Christianity, and even to Christians like us? What will these things be like when all will be lifted? As a pastor, I've been thinking about, well, what has been happening to my flock? What will happen to my church? Let's start with church building, physically meeting. What will happen to Sunday school? offerings, the organizations, the missions, and what will happen to the church and Christianity as a whole. The disciples have no television, no radio, no computer, and most likely no books. So they just prayed and talked and encouraged one another. And they pray in one accord, united in spirit and heart, in obedience, waiting. Have you been praying and praying hard in the last 11 weeks or so? Have you been praying more than before? What have you been praying for or about? Now, are you closer to God than before? We've been waiting. We have not been worshiping together with other brothers and sisters on the regular Sundays that we are used to for all these years. We've been watching our own pastors and most likely other churches and even famous pastors in their preaching. Do you consider yourself closer to God now than before? Do you want or expect God to do something miraculous now before you go back to church and after you go back to church? Pentecost was a miracle. We all know that. The disciples did not expect anything. All of a sudden, the Holy Spirit came and everything broke loose. Now, we don't know what God will do. Will there be any miracles when we go back to church? But do you expect something different? That you, yourself, as a Christian and your church and Christianity will be stronger when the time comes? What would you expect? The big question really is, are you prepared? Are you prepared to go back to church? Are you prepared that many other people who did not go to church before may be now more ready for spiritual awakening or ready to be shared about the gospel? But are we prepared for it? See, the Holy Spirit moved in the disciples. The disciples were just looking for things normal, waiting for the unknown. It's the Holy Spirit that moved and changed the world through them. Do you think the Holy Spirit, our God, can also move you and your local church, your denomination, and Christianity as a whole? And maybe this is a chance to change the world. But the disciples had to be ready. Yes, I believe they were ready. God's timing was ready. But the disciples have been praying in one accord, in unity of heart and mind, for their 7 days. Now, what they were locked down. Then Pentecost came. Can I say that I am ready for spiritual explosion. My spiritual explosion, my church explosion, and God's message and God's love to expand and permeate through this world. The lesson learned from Pentecost is not just the power of God. It's not just talking about speaking in tongues. It is the preparation for a spiritual explosion. How I pray that I as a Christian, I as a pastor, am right this moment ready if God says now it is